Welcome to the Biochar Show, where innovation meets sustainability. I'm your host, Meghan K, and today we have an exciting episode featuring two incredible leaders in the biochar and sustainability space. First, we welcome Don Coyne, CEO of the Australia-New Zealand Biochar Industry Group. With over 25 years in horticulture, Don has been a driving force behind biochar adoption in Australia and New Zealand. As the founder of Byron Biochar, he has helped advance the industry through high-quality biochar production, field trials, and environmental strategy. Joining Don is Melissa Rebbeck, a leader in climate adaptation and sustainable agriculture with over 40 projects under her belt. As business development manager at Metamorph Engineering, she focuses on continuous pyrolysis technology for biochar, renewable energy, and carbon removal. She also chairs the Australia and New Zealand Biochar Industry Group, where she's helping roll out a plan to turn 50 million tons of waste into biochar, with the goal of cutting up to 30% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions through clean energy solutions. We have so much to explore today, from industry innovation to the future of biochar in climate solutions. Hello, Don and Melissa. Welcome all the way from Australia.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for having us here. It's great to be able to chat about this amazing, innovative industry.
Well, thank you for taking the time to join and give listeners something new to talk about and hear, and also learn more about what it's like in Australia and also New Zealand. So we'll start off with Don. I'm curious, you've been a leading voice for biochar adoption across Australia and New Zealand. What first drew you into this space, and how have you seen biochar landscape evolve?
Thanks, Megan. Yes, look, my journey into biochar began in 2011 after the global financial crisis forced me to sell my landscape gardening business. Around that time, I read World on the Edge by Lester Brown. It was a wake-up call. It laid out a plan to slash emissions by 80% by 2020. While we didn't quite hit that target, it sparked something in me. I wanted to be part of the solution to human-induced global warming. If we caused the problem, then we could fix it, right? Then came a pivotal moment. I attended a biochar workshop on the biochar revolution. There I met Dr. Paul Taylor and Professor Stephen Joseph, who introduced me to the concept of baking, not burning biomass in a low oxygen environment. I was hooked, watching biomass turn into this black, lightweight, sponge-like material that boosts microbial life and retains water and nutrients blew my mind. I'd heard of carbon neutral, but I'd never heard of carbon negative, and this became my purpose. I started experimenting in my community garden, learning hands-on how to make and apply biochar. Over the years, I've watched the awareness and markets grow. At our 2014 conference, I saw firsthand the innovation in action, like Doug Powell, the WA farmer feeding biochar to cows and using dung beetles to bury it. That led to a groundbreaking paper with global impact. And now, seeing biochar used in 3D printed buildings for carbon sequestration and enhanced properties in concrete, it's incredible. To see biochar being used in road base and asphalt on highways is amazing. The ANZBIG roadmap is clear. Soil, non-soil, and high-tech applications are opening up endless possibilities for biochar for carbon removal and biocarbon for emissions reduction in applications like green steel production. It's not just a product, it's actually a movement.
It's very true. And Melissa, you've led over 40 sustainable projects. What drew you to the biochar space?
So I was a senior research scientist for state government here in South Australia, and I built this program about climate adaptations and risk management for farmers. And as we started to explore climate change, because early in my career we weren't supposed to talk about it, we were talking about how to manage risk and some solutions to better manage climate risk and change. But there was very little solutions. And after 16 years, I left and had children and began my own business. And and started working with more locally with farmers and looked at soil health and got involved in biochar then. And after my first research project, I was hooked in the results that we had in terms of how it built carbon and improved productivity and yield and reduced fertiliser use. With my business management acumen, started going into project development for farmers and for the wider community, looking at the whole solutions when you actually make and use biochar. And so, that's my journey. I think I'm, with the background of climate change and climate science, it's highly concerning. I do call myself a climate scientist as well. Highly concerning about where we're heading, and there's very, very few solutions. And this is one that can solve a whole lot of problems for agricultural productivity, but also decarbonise at the same time while you make biochar and improve revenue. So I was then adopted by the Biochar Industry Group on the board and now chair it. And I'm very conceptual and really take my role very seriously in how we're going to lead this industry forward to mitigate up to 30% of Australia's greenhouse emissions.
Don, rather than producing biochar yourself, you operate as a broker and industry connector. How has that position given you more of a unique perspective on the challenges and opportunities across different biochar markets?
Yeah, well, Megan, when I launched Byron Biochar, my business plan had to navigate complex New South Wales regulations. You could make and use biochar on your property, but selling it, even to your neighbour, triggered waste classification laws. In New South Wales, biochar is still seen as a waste, not a resource, bundled with incineration and combustion tech under waste to energy. And that's a major barrier to scaling. That's why ANZBIG's first position paper is so critical. It calls for decoupling pyrolysis and gasification from that outdated classification. We're advocating for a circular model where renewable energy and bioproducts are co-produced, not just burnt for single-use energy. So back then, I offered a mobile service with the locally built Kentucky Byron unit and partnered with an EPA-approved producer to distribute biochar and wood vinegar. I targeted the region's top 5 horticultural crops, so they in the Northern Rivers here. So macadamia, blueberries, avocado, custard apples and coffee were the top 5 back then. Now, as CEO of ANZBIG, I hold a unique and, I guess, neutral position, listening to our members' real-world wins and challenges. Through our roadmap, the first of its kind globally, we're actively breaking down the barriers to a safe, scalable and sustainable biochar industry, mapping the whole ecosystem from feedstock to tech providers to end users. So it's not just important, but it's actually very inspiring.
And are you still using the mobile kilns or no?
That was in the early days, and no, my business is actually totally online now. So I'm a reseller and have various suppliers. So yeah, but I did sell it to a local farmer who's hopefully still using it.
And Melissa, at Metamorph Engineering, you work with continuous pyrolysis technology. Can you explain how this technology is improving biochar production and its impact on carbon removal?
Sure. I think with continuous technology, and the technology that we have in particular, there is the ability to control the temperature at the throughput, the feed rate of the material, but also modify the screw system to suit the material that's fed through. Our technology can run at anywhere from 300 up to 1100 degrees Celsius. If you actually produce biochar at lower temperature, there's more available carbon, and that's better for agriculture. But if you produce it at higher temperature, you actually increase the popcorn-like effect of the material. It has much more surface area and porosity, but also the charge on the char becomes greater. So that can be of higher value to other industries as well. So we can make biochar fit for purpose. The other thing of running it through a screw-like system rather than a rotary drum is that you have much more even pyrolysis, so that all of the material is actually pyrolysed and pyrolysed evenly. And the other thing that we do is actually use the syngas to control the temperature and then the processes and the end product of the biochar. And that's kind of being better documented now to have a higher quality char. So, our chars are highly sought after in larger quantities for larger takeoff agreements because we can produce that consistent quality. And we have a machine where we run tests to actually make, test materials through our system and, run things like a yield response curve where you can put material through slower, at lower temperatures and check the char quality and carbon content, and then push the temperature up and put it through higher temperatures, and you'll actually shave off some yield, but you get a high quality product. I think the thing about chars too is it's quite voluminous, and actually when it becomes more lightweight, it's actually worth more value than when it's lower weight to some industries. It's a very tricky substance to sell so it's really fit for purpose, and working closely with clients as well about what sort of char they want and for what purposes, and to make it for those purposes. The charge on the char is really important, and I think that's why we call it biochar, because the surface area has cations and anions, and it's like a magnet to many things. Like, if it's used in roads, it bonds very well with local road aggregates. In agriculture, it can be used to do things like seed coat the seed, especially in drought, and protect it, but provide it water, but stimulate that seed to germinate. And so that's really exciting. And it can be used in fertilizer, for example, and fertilizer granules, and it will just stick to the fertilizer granule, and it will stop that granule from denitrifying or going into the water table, like soaking down through there and keeping it in the soil for longer. And that actually has a positive effect for, especially, it's one of the widest uses actually of biochar globally is with synthetic fertilizer. Synthetic fertilizer costs are going through the roof, and this is a really great way of reducing fertilizer use, increasing yield, improving soil health at the same time.
So Dawn, as a former technical officer with the NSW-DIP, you've worked hands-on with field trials. Can you share some of the more promising outcomes you've seen in terms of agricultural productivity, soil health, or carbon sequestration?
At the New South Wales DPI sugarcane trials, and I saw firsthand how biochar slashes nitrous oxide emissions, greenhouse gas, which is 300 times more potent than CO2, while improving nitrogen use efficiency. So that means fewer emissions, healthier soils, and more resilient crops. DPI's opportunities for sequestration and emissions reductions report also shows that biochar reduces methane, nitrous oxide, and ammonia emissions during manure composting, cutting odour, retaining nutrients, and reducing climate impact. We've seen incredible results in Ansbig's biochar in regenerative agriculture trial at Soft Agriculture in northern New South Wales, with just 200 kilograms per hectare of liquid biochar mineral complex significantly boosted pasture productivity. That success led to trials on agri-solar farms, where combining biochar feeding for livestock with reactive soil barriers under solar panels has shown promise in making these systems climate positive and dramatically enhancing soil carbon. Beyond agriculture, the future, as I mentioned, of biochar and 3D concrete printing is a game changer. Replacing a portion of sand and cement for automated carbon sequestration in one of the hardest to abate sectors. In road base and asphalt, biochar improves durability, especially in high rainfall zones, while locking away carbon in our infrastructure. And in mine rehabilitation, one of our members, Vital Chemicals hydromulch products with biochar, are helping to stabilise highway banks and restore post-mining landscapes, positioning biochar as a major player in the emerging billion-dollar mine closure industry by 2030. So the possibilities for biochar are not just promising, they're actually transformational.
And Melissa, you've worked across agriculture, water management, and policy. What are some key biochar applications that could make the biggest difference in these areas?
Sure. Look, I mean, I'll talk about two relevant case studies. I think globally, so the International Biochar Industry Group and US did a global survey on how biochar is being used. And I did mention the biggest use is actually in cereal production, combining biochar with synthetic fertilizers. It's kind of a bit of a double-edged sword because synthetic fertilizers do actually increase the acidity of soil and have an impact on microbial growth. The top 10 centimetres of soil sustains all life on Earth, and 50% of global soil carbon is in the atmosphere. The great thing about biochar is that it recycles biomass waste from agricultural land back into carbon, fast tracks that return of carbon to the earth. The whole thing about biochar is don't burn your waste biomass. It's a resource. Don't put it in the atmosphere. It belongs as carbon back in the soil. One of the global trends is actually putting biochar with synthetic fertilizer. It'll do two things. It will actually reduce the need to use synthetic fertilizer, and we've just imported the most amount of synthetic fertilizer ever into Australia because farmers are needing to use more to get the same or reduced yield under climate change. So you can combine those together, improve your, the cost of synthetic fertilizer is the biggest cost on farms next to labour. So you can dramatically, half your fertilizer use, plus there's papers to show you'll double your yield by putting about 20% of biochar with fertilizer. So that's one of the biggest and most growing trends. At the same time, that biochar will mitigate the acidity that the fertilizer does and start to improve soil carbon, soil health, water holding capacity, and build the microbes. So that's a really good trend. What I would like to see longer term is that whole need for synthetic fertilizer is negated and farmers are starting to combine it with microbials and inject it with microbials and other things. And in fact, you can make biochar enhanced fertilizers that are much, much better for the soil than with synthetics. That might be a longer term trend. The other major use is actually feeding biochar through animals, because when you feed it through an animal, you get this multiple benefit. You will have improved animal growth. I did some trials feeding it to dairy, which is published. You'll have improved milk yield. You'll have improved animal health, increase in production, better feed efficiency. But the really cool thing is that the biochar isn't ingested. It ends up in the manure of the dung. And might I say, when you feed it to animals, as well as published papers to show it reduces methane, which is one of the biggest agricultural emissions is methane. But the biochar stays in the dung, right? And then it continues to improve the soil in the way that I just explained it can do through soil applications. You get this ongoing cascading benefit of feeding it through animals, and the animals just walk around and fertilise your paddock for you, which is really great. One other thing I'd like to say is the whole circular economic benefit of making and using biochar on farm. So Metamorph, who I work for, are starting to work with some very large cereal producers who actually turn their cereal stubble waste into biochar through the continuous systems and then apply that biochar directly onto their farms. But at the same time, they're producing renewable energy to do an add-on business with. So there's opportunities for alternative use of that power. It could be to power a glass house or something like that to mitigate the risk on their farm, because under drought, 80% of the profit is made. The best 3 years in 10, the worst 3 years in 10, you make a loss. So in those drier seasons, at least they've got some other income from something else. So these are, the whole opportunities of actually making and using biochar is triple circular economy, and it's really great.
Yeah, I read an article about they were feeding it to chickens and made a huge difference as well. And I know the methane is an issue in certain places in Canada and definitely the States. So
it's really important at this point to touch on the carbon reduction, because you're actually, when you make biochar, you're trapping carbon in the biochar, which is highly tradable. And that's what we're saying is, 10 to 30% of reducing emissions. So that waste would normally produce carbon dioxide. When you make it into biochar, means that the carbon's trapped in that biochar for centuries to millennia. So you've got that, right? But at the same time, you're producing energy, which then can be used as electricity, or some systems make alternative fuels. So that's another emission avoidance. Then when you apply biochar, you've got the priming effect of increasing carbon in the soil. If you're feeding it through animals, you can reduce methane, and if you're combining it with fertilisers, you reduce nitrous oxide emissions. We're just saying just with the biochar and energy alone, it's 10 to 30%, but when you use it in agriculture, that hasn't been substantiated yet. There's papers around that could be another 10 to 20%. So we're talking huge opportunities to mitigate global climate change rapidly if we were supported with policies, which they're starting to emerge globally.
So we talked about the positives. So I'm curious, Don, like what are the biggest challenges facing the biochar industry today? You were talking about policies, Melissa. Is there something else, like what needs to happen in order for mainstream adoption?
Yeah. Well, look, despite biochar's clear benefits, strong return on investment and proven success outlined in our Farmers Guide and also the National Roadmap, it's still not recognised in Australia's carbon credit system. So ANZBIG continues to advocate for a dedicated ACCU method. Our expression of interest was highly commended last year, and we remain committed to breaking down the policy barriers that limit adoption. We believe land managers should be rewarded for delivering ecosystem services, restoring degraded land, improving soil health, and helping companies meet ESG goals while actively removing carbon from the atmosphere. So in New South Wales alone, as an example, biochar has the potential to cut emissions by 1.6 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent annually and contribute to renewable energy production. So agriculture accounts for 15% of New South Wales emissions, the majority from livestock methane, which we've just spoken about, and biochar is a natural fit. But unfortunately, the current regulatory framework still groups pyrolysis and gasification with incineration and combustion, which are linear, single-use waste pathways. And that's like treating biochar as single-use plastic. It's a waste of valuable bioresources. So we're calling for a clear differentiation. Pyrolysis, gasification, and carbonisation technologies must be recognised as circular solutions. They retain and recycle a portion of biomass, creating the high-value bioproducts for agriculture and the built environment that we've spoken about. And this is how we scale a regenerative, low-emissions bioeconomy.
And Melissa, you've worked on policy and business development. What role do governments and investors need to play in order to scale biochar solutions effectively?
Well, funny you say that, because we're coming into an election at the moment in Australia, and, a lot of the election promises are, on net zero or not zero, net zero, or nuclear power, or keeping burning on coal, which is terrible for the environment. I mean, nuclear power, scary. We have the solutions. Our industry has the solutions to mitigate 10 to 30% of global emissions. If we're talking Australia and New Zealand, 10 to 30% of that. So we just need politicians to recognise that and put some money behind our industry, because in doing that, we'll also be managing waste. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry because, of the value of biochar, of the value of the carbon removal certificates by making biochar because of the renewable energy. So we need policy to support our industry. There are some other policies that are existing globally that we could look at and use them to develop policy here in Australia. A conference coming up in June. ANZBIG's conference is in Coolangatta. I'm sure Don will talk about that. And we do actually have a Denmark policy as an example. They tax farmers for emissions, and then they incentivise farmers to use, so that when they tax it, that goes into a fund that then incentivises farmers and subsidises pyrolysis so that it can scale it up. I probably talked about that policy very badly, but it's an amazing policy. It's a $1 billion policy. And then there's policy in Switzerland that mandates the use of biochar in roads. I know there's US policy that heavily subsidises biochar for agricultural use, but also mandates that biochar must be made from partially burnt timber. And so from all the wildfires that are in California, for example, we have so many of them here in Australia. So there's so many different policies that could be explored, but it cuts across. It's not just climate change policy. There's agricultural policy. There's renewable energy policy. There's so many that it can cut across, that there's something in it for just about every sector to decarbonise. And so we just want these policymakers at a conference. We want to advocate it. We want our message out there that we can do this. We just need support to scale. I see, from my background in local government politics, that industry has a big role to play in this. And, we're talking about Trump and his non-supportive of renewable energy. But industry will solve this, because going into biochar and pyrolysis production is economically lucrative, because there's 3 revenue streams, not to mention the cost of removing waste. So some pay to remove waste. So, for example, we can turn 5,000 tonnes per annum of biomass waste into $3.5 million from biochar production, renewable energy and carbon removal certificates. We can turn 20,000 tonne of waste into $12 million of revenue in Australian dollars. So that's an example. If 50 million metric tonnes of biochar is produced, it creates something like 300 million gigajoules of energy, which is worth billions of dollars. 50 million metric tonnes of biochar, of waste is turned to biochar, that's about 15 billion tonnes of biochar, that's multi-billions of dollars. And that's just to touch on those 3 revenue streams, not to mention we've had policy in Australia about how we need to get to 100 million in gross value production in Australia of agriculture by 2030. We're only at 60 billion. We need to get to 100 billion. The biochar can do that. If you just put biochar on and in small amounts, we can achieve a 40% increase in production. So hopefully politicians will hear this, but philanthropic funders as well, if they get behind us. ANZBIC has a roadmap to roll this out. We have plans. We have very clear plans. We can show these funders how we're going to achieve this and when. And as we start to get more funding into our industry group, we're rolling out more and more of our plans. And we can do this if we're funded just by having investors and philanthropic funders coming to us. I know, and sorry, I've spoken a little bit too long, there's a lot of investors out there that are really excited about these type of projects because of the fact that you can increase revenue and decarbonise. And so I know that industry investors can solve this, but we can fast track it and need to fast track it for the good of the planet. So we need more investment.
I might have missed this because we were talking about, I think before we recorded, but does Australia do carbon credits or no?
We do have carbon credits. You can for soil, and we do have them for emission avoidance. So there are ways and means of using that at the moment. For example, biochar, you can, if you make and use it in the same catchment, you can get carbon credits from your soil. At the moment, Australian carbon credit units are around about $38 per tonne of carbon. Puro.earth, and there's other carbon credit trading platforms, give you in excess of 200 Australian dollars for the carbon in the biochar. So by just making biochar from waste, the sheer volume of carbon in that biochar is measured, highly trackable, highly auditable, and there's a methodology that's been created on the back of some guidelines through the International Panel on Climate Change. So that's used, biochar quantities are measured, and then those that are in biochar production will get a carbon payback as long as their technology is registered. They go through this life cycle assessment. So our projects are achieving, hundreds of thousands of dollars through carbon removal certificates on this Puro, on this platform. There are other platforms, it's horses for courses. Some will also recognise the renewable energy sides. There's opportunities to explore those. So at the moment, most of the carbon that we're producing and mitigating is actually sold offshore and not owned by Australia. So there's a whole opportunity for Australian government to own that by having better carbon policies. So let's see what they come up with in this new election.
Fingers crossed. Don, you've supported and observed the growth of technologies from small kilns to commercial pyrolysis systems. From your view across the supply chain, what are the most exciting advancements in biochar production and application?
What fascinates me, Megan, most about biochar is its scalability and versatility. So you can make it in a backyard barbecue, a solar-powered toilet in a village, or a commercial kiln producing renewable gas, bio-oil and wood vinegar. Each scale serves a purpose, engaging communities, regenerating landscapes and fighting climate change. We're working with a diverse group of partners: community gardens, graziers, land care and emergency services, road builders, and sustainable construction teams. One standout application that we've spoken about already is feeding biochar to cows. It improves animal health and weight gain. And when dung beetles bury their enriched manure, it re-engineers soil from the ground up. So it boosts fertility and slashing nutrient runoff into waterways, which is so important. So we're really just scratching the surface. I mean, one of the most exciting frontiers to me is agri-solar farms. By installing reactive barriers, biochar barriers under solar panels and integrating biochar into livestock feed, we can supercharge soil carbon, manage runoff, and transform these systems into climate-positive energy landscapes. At the moment, the renewable energy sector is not, it's not carbon negative. It's creates emissions with all of the gadgets involved. So then there's the rise of the liquid biochar mineral complexes. So by co-pyrolysing, say, manures and woody feedstocks with something like clay or basalt and adding fertiliser to it, we're creating sprayable biochar with serious punch. In our trials, just 200 kilograms per hectare lifted pasture productivity. Evidence that less can do more. And this innovation is backed by science and led by pioneers like Professor Stephen Joseph, who's one of ANZBIG's founding and honorary members. I've also just announced that he was behind Net Zero, who has come second in the X Prize competition. So that's with Net Zero, and so they're using Stephen's open source kiln there. So congratulations to Stephen and the team at Net Zero. So biochar isn't just a product, as mentioned, it's a platform for regenerative change across sectors and scales.
And Melissa, you have extensive experience in natural resource management. How do you see biochar fitting into the larger conversation about sustainability and climate resilience?
Well, firstly, the waste sector is either burning or letting a lot of biomass waste rot or sit in landfill, which produces emissions. So the concept of biochar, and this waste biomass we're talking primarily comes from soil. It was something that was once living, was produced from our soil. We're burning it or letting it rot. We can't do that anymore. We see that as a resource which we need to turn back into carbon and get back into our soils where it belongs. The scary thing is that our soil productivity is declining. So there's this regeneration movement where more and more people are understanding that we need to regenerate our soils. I said the top 10 centimetres of soil sustains most life on Earth. There's more and more realisation that soil is alive with a diversity of microbes, or should be alive with a diversity of microbes and bacteria and fungi, and that then helps the plants grow that produces food in a growing population. We need to work on that soil profile. Biochar has a huge role to play in that when we return the carbon back to the soil. But biochar is bioactive. It's understanding the properties of the biochar being this large surface area, porosity, charge, and how that can work in with our soil health and the many other things that biochar can be applied with. So it has a huge role to play, and it actually should be part of agricultural policy to increase soil carbon and return that back to the soil. And so, every farmer should be looking at, well, okay, I've got some biomass waste. What can I do with that to get it back into my soil and turn it back into carbon? There's many opportunities to do that. They can make it through, as Don said, small own kilns. They can make it in a pit, or they can turn it into biochar through these continuous systems. But even the municipal councils that collect all the green waste from gardens, they have an opportunity to make their own biochar and produce power to power the facility from these continuous kilns, and also gain carbon credits and potentially also claim their community as carbon negative. So there's a few examples there, but it's just the whole ethos of what are we doing with our waste, biomass waste being in particular. So our biochar movement is about clean waste feedstocks. So the highest amount globally is from forestry residues of forestry waste. The second amount is cereal stubbles. Then we have things like nut waste, and of course biosolids from human waste can also be turned into biochar, which is really exciting, manures and the like. So it is not waste, it's a resource. We need it to transform our industry, and we can generate revenue and decarbonise. So there's where I see the opportunities going forward.
And this is for both of you. If you could correct one major misconception people have about biochar, what would it be? Don, do you want to start?
Okay, yes, sure. Where will the biomass come from to make biochar? We've already identified the answer in our ANZBIG roadmap. So Australia generates between 50 to 100 million tonnes of commercially accessible residual biomass every year, most of which is currently burnt or sent to landfill. It's not just a waste, it's fueling global warming. We're not advocating for deforestation. Biochar doesn't require cutting down forests. The feedstock already exists in the form of bioproducts from sustainable forestry, cropping residues, livestock manure, food processing, and even animal carcasses. Biochar can be made from biomass across all three kingdoms, the plant, animal, and fungi kingdoms, and they are all renewable. This is about transforming waste into climate action. With Australia producing just 10 to 20,000 tonnes of biochar annually at the moment, we are barely scratching the surface. As we scale up renewable bioenergy systems that co-produce biochar and transition towards electrification, we will not run out of biomass, in my opinion, especially by 2030, when we aim to cut emissions in Australia as part of the Paris Agreement by 43% and New Zealand as well. So, of course, biomass must be used in a sustainable and regenerative way, and that means maintaining biodiversity, supporting circular systems, and learning from global best practices, like those in Europe on forest and land management. If we delay emissions reduction and carbon removal, the burden only grows. Biochar offers scalable, science-backed pathway to store carbon, reduce emissions, and regenerate land using waste we're already producing. Mm-hmm. It's a climate solution hiding in plain sight.
And Melissa, what about you?
Look, I think that one about accessing waste is really important. And, the waste that we're primarily sourcing are those that are otherwise burnt or left to rot. And so that's really important. I think the other one about combustion versus pyrolysis. So combustion is essentially burning with oxygen. And then that means that the carbon goes into the atmosphere when the material is burnt. Pyrolysis is is igniting without oxygen and high temperatures. So that means the carbon's trapped in the material and stays under the atmosphere. It doesn't go into the atmosphere, stays there for centuries to millennia. I think the other thing is that biochar is not boutique-y. Like obviously it's a historical practice, but why now? Historically, biochar has been made for centuries to millennia. It's been found in the Amazon. And in fact, there's a theory that the Amazon would not be the Amazon without those cultural practices of making biochar in the soil. It's been used by Asians for centuries, making a biochar in rice paddies, digging furrows. It's been used by Indigenous groups in Australia. It's been made in these kiln-type ovens for a long, long time. Why now is because the technology is ramping up. We can make it to scale. We can make large volumes. We can push 20,000 tonnes per annum through metamorph technology, for example, and there's other technology globally that can do more. There's more other technology in Australia that's likely to do more and come on the market very soon. And now we can make consistent, high-quality volumes to order of biochar. So it's, there's room for a lot, but I think there's this misconception that it's boutique-y. It's not anymore. It's a real thing with very valuable, viable technology that works and has been used and is being used in Australia and globally. So if, you just need to Google it and even just come part of ANZBIG and look at the breadth of technology that we have. We have 20-odd members with multi-million-dollar technology that is available today to deploy and use.
So this is another question for both of you. What advice would you give to someone looking to get involved in the biochar or sustainability sector?
Look, I would start at the end and work backwards. So if you've got to get down the bottom of the dung beetle tunnel and analyse the, biochar mineral complex that the dung beetle larvae have lived on as the first part of their life and then excreted out, that is the value-added product at the bottom of that tunnel. Work backwards from there. Secure your off-take agreement for the biochar first. Work out your market. That would be my advice. Where are you going to sell it? Let's say you decided to use algae as your feedstock, right? Now, algae, from what I understand, is about 50% of all photosynthesis on Earth. Work out what algal biochar is best used for. Get it tested, analysed and characterised. Work out what market is best fit for the best price. See if it tracks carbon credits. Do field trialling to see what are the benefits, what are the ROI. Develop some case studies and see if it's worth pursuing. If it is, then you can secure that feedstock to ensure you can supply at scale. Choose the pre-processing equipment that's required. Land on your biochar tech that fits for you. And then the post-processing equipment, you're going to grind it up. Are you going to add other things to it? Are you going to bag it up? How are you going to sell it? And then be able to supply that value-added product that is competitively priced and works. So if the business case stacks up, the investment will come, in my opinion.
Melissa, what do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, this is what I do. I did it as a consultant, depending on the size of the project. I started with a very large project I was consulting on. So I scaled the globe for technology and did a matrix of what each of their outputs were, what the technology costed. So then that helped me decide on the best technologies. And it's one of the reasons why I'm working for the company I am now, because it's a very, very great company, Metamorph Engineering. Join ANZBIG or look on our website, because actually we do have all the technologies listed. We've got a publicly available listing of all their members and what they provide. So have a look at those and see which one of those suits. I think I would start with how much biomass have you got? How much biomass will then you match that to the technology that will whittle down the number of technologies that are available. Then go to those technology providers and get them to help you with your business case. That's what I do. So I help anyone have a look at the business case We go through a questionnaire of what biomass they've got available, and then we'll put it into a financial model and show them the business case and the payback of the tech. That financial model is really great to be able to get your investment or loans or whatever is needed for the technology. We actually help sell the biochar as well. I think there's ways to aggregate those sales together. So as we start to have more and more clients, we've got bigger takeoff agreements. Actually, I think Don, you said 10 to 20,000 tonnes. I think it might be more now because there's larger takeoff agreements with some of these industrial users that are using, starting to get biochar into cement and roads. There's more help with aggregating those together. And actually, we have a list of those that actually want to purchase biochar now. So I would start with that. But there's a whole range of members that we have with ANZBIG, anywhere from technology providers, biochar acquirers, investors, researchers. Immerse yourself in the industry and see how real it is and what real amazing case studies are out there. The other one is look at our Farmer's Guide. That's available on the website, Australia New Zealand Biochar Industry Group website. It's not really just a guide for farmers because it actually does list all the merits of the different technologies as well, and a whole range of case studies in how biochar is used. And it's got thousands and thousands of references right throughout it. There's something like 70,000 published papers on biochar globally. There's some of them in the meta-analysis that actually summarise 14,000 papers, for example. So, and then the summary of the outcomes of those are in our Farmer's Guide. So it really just makes it in a really readable format. You can go to the right chapter and read the bit you want to read.
So this just ties into my last question. Melissa, you're leading a pretty bold plan with ANZBIG into turning 50 million tonnes of waste into biochar and cut a big chunk of Australia's emissions. How are all the industry members getting behind this, and what should people be looking out for next in Australia, I should say?
Yeah, I would not claim that I'm leading it. I think that my role is a bit like Don's, is that connectivity of stakeholders. And I think, what's amazing about this industry and why I align with it is that we're all aligned in our thinking, that we know that this is one of the best answers for net zero, improving the economy, creating jobs, conservation. So part of the role I see is actually enabling all of the amazing people that are part of our industry. So we've got 220 plus members, but 70 of those are volunteers across our 5 working groups at the moment. And those, I think we've got a 6th working group, which is now about Indigenous artisanal biochar use. And those members keep coming and saying, well, hey, I want to lead this sector. Yes, please. And each of those working groups have a number of members that are helping roll these things out. So, for example, we've got a policy working group, marketing, communications, innovation, and standards and certification. Standards and certification is really important. They've achieved some wonderful things. All volunteers, as we get some funding in through, we're funded through membership, sponsorships, philanthropic funding. As we get more and doing more research as well, we're starting to be able to put some funding towards these working groups, but we need a lot more. We fund our CEO full time. We have a couple of other part-time people, but the rest is at the moment volunteer, and we are achieving so much. We're punching above our weight because of the motivation and energy of these people aligned with the same goal. I think we're just on the cusp now because we are really well structured and set up with our roadmap. We're a company limited by guarantee. We have opportunity to be able to donate. So we're ready. We're ready to be invested, and we have a great roadmap. And I know that we'll get there with the momentum that's happening at the moment. We can't do this alone. We need to enable as many people as we can that they're aligning with our industry.
Thank you both so much for taking the time out. I know you're all the way in Australia, and just wanted to say, it was a very interesting conversation, and I definitely learned a lot, and I think listeners will as well. I wanted to know if there was a specific place, like if people are interested in where to get a hold of you. I know you mentioned to go on the ANZBIG website. Is that the best place for them to sort of reach out and see more of what you're doing?
Yeah, look, Meghan, it is anzbig.org. All the information's there. You can download a free digital version of our roadmap, 2030 roadmap. Also, you can purchase both digital and paperback versions of our Farmer's Guide to Biochar. And we also have a code of practice to the sustainable production and use of biochar. And just for the viewers, a very important development is we are working with Standards Australia this year to produce the Australian standard for the grading of biochar, biocarbon and associated products. So that is probably the biggest development for the industry in years. And also, you can go on and join ANZBIG, look at all the member benefits and details. Melissa mentioned our product and services directory. So there are, approximately 12 categories. So everything from the feedstock providers to the pre-processing equipment, to the biochar tech itself, to the post-processing equipment, and then the end users of the biochar as well. Our annual conference, the Biochar Expo 2025, will be held at the Southern Cross University on the Gold Coast. So it's right next to Coolangatta Airport. It's an international airport, and that'll be on June 25 and 26. And so we'll be covering a lot of the themes and topics that we've spoken about today. We've just closed our abstracts and received over 55 abstracts on all of the themes and topics discussed today. It's going to be our biggest event ever. We'll also hold a networking dinner and awards ceremony. If anyone out there knows anyone that's making a difference in this space in Australia and New Zealand, please go on to anzbig.org and nominate them. And I would like to invite the Biochar Show to come to Australia and cover the event. But also, of course, we'll be live streaming and recording internationally as well. But thank you to Biochar Today as well for being a media partner of Biochar Expo 2025.
Fantastic. Well, thank you to my listeners. And one way for you to show support for the show is by subscribing on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube. Don't forget to rate and review because 5-star goes a long way. It really helps others find the show and share this episode with someone who might find it valuable. A big thank you to all our listeners, to Don and Melissa again. We'll see you next time on the Biochar Show.